Hello, this is Gabe Matthews with Polyplane.com. This is the second video in the Intro to Rendering series that I'm doing. The first element that we're going to take a look at in a little bit of depth is the environment we are rendering in. As I stated in part 1 of this series, the environment is the virtual space in which you're rendering your model. This can include a lightbox, a studio, a simulated environment. That's where other 3D models in the space are used to represent the scene, or a composite scene, usually added in later after the components are rendered, or like in some programs like KeyShot does, you can actually composite your composite scene in while you're rendering, which is really useful. The first type of environment we're going to talk about here is the Lightbox. Now, you can think of the Lightbox as a small room where you're taking a photo of your model and with a few specific lights in place. These lights would include a fill light, a directional light, and sometimes a secondary light that may or may not be colored. The Lightbox type of environment usually is reserved for small to medium-sized product renderings, and oftentimes will have some sort of solid or subtly textured background to assist in making the rendering a little more compelling. In this example, I've got a watch floating in space to show some detail on the side. There's an overhead light which is providing the overall illumination and some directional light off to the side that is lighting up the rest of the scene. This was rendered in KeyShot with the stock softbox background that comes with the program. I later went in with Photoshop and kind of brushed up some of the highlights to make it a little more amplified and pretty. So the Lightbox as an environment isn't always full of shadows like you're seeing here. Oftentimes, like in a lot of product renderings, the rendering artist will blow out the background so it feels like the space goes on forever. This is a popular technique that offers a lot of flexibility when you're setting up a render, usually with like a flat white or a flat black background to really amplify whatever is being rendered. The next type of rendering environment is the studio. So this is probably the most common environment for rendering, or at least for single subject matter type renders. The studio type environment mimics an actual photography studio in the way the lights are set up as well as the scale. This is used for cars, retail environments, and all other sorts of types of rendering. I use this type of environment for my medium to large sized product designs as well as exhibit work. In this example, I'm showing a slight tip up of a computer. The floor has a gloss on it and the main fill light is coming from the global illumination of the scene. The background was completely white. Then I added in a slight vignette and some soft shadows in the second pass of the rendering. This is a good time to mention that you'll rarely just output a rendering and be done. Many times you're going to do it multiple renderings and then output them into a single file via Photoshop. And this gives you a little more control of the individual elements in the scene and enables you a little more flexibility and control of the output. Moving on, the next type of environment is the simulated environment. So the simulated environment rendering is my most favorite way to render because it gives valuable context to the subject matter you're rendering. In this setup, you're using lights in the space, often paired with a simulated sky, global illumination, and oftentimes additional lighting to simulate the real lighting in the space. And this can be amplified with the use of HDR lighting, which we'll discuss HDRI lighting a little bit in the lighting video. In the example, I've got a retail table set up, and this was used for the Chinese brand Anta. I was showing an imaginary product launch, what it might look like in their store versus going to the space and trying to composite the renderings in. I modeled the space, then added the lighting and the concepts. This way everything had a consistent finish to it and it made for a more fluid presentation. The biggest benefit to simulated environments as a rendering space is that you could get a consistent polish to the renderings. Think about every 3D animated movie you've seen. Those are all renderings within a simulated environment, and it leads to just dynamite results. And then finally, the composite environment renderings rely heavily on accurate lighting via HDRI. That's, by the way, that stands for high dynamic range image, which again, I'll cover that in the lighting video, and accurate shadow and light setup with the correct photography or video backplates to get the camera angle match just right, because visual effects people out there, you've probably felt the pain of your first rotoscoping job or adjusting the color temperature of your scene versus the rendering, or even adjusting the physical camera lens of the render to match the perspective of how the photo or video was taken so that it kind of lines up and everything's matching in perspective. And this can be really tricky, but with the right kind of tools, it can be done pretty easily. So composites can be the most challenging type of render to pull off and not look super synthetic, but it is possible with time and patience. I do most of my composite work in Photoshop and After Effects, but when I do product rendering or rendering tests, I recommend using KeyShot because of its immediate results. This example is shot from an article I wrote about KeyShot for Catalyst magazine. This was way back when it was still hypershot by Bunk Speed. Its speed and easy makes it really fun and rewarding rewarding to use, especially now that Luxion is the company that owns it. I didn't intend for this to be a plug for Keyshot, but if you're going to check out a rendering software package, Keyshot is a great tool, especially if you're using Rhino, because it uses a cool little tech plugin called live linking, where it's constantly updating per your model in the Rhino file, so it's constantly looking back at that. So it's kind of a cool link that way. It's worth checking out. I think if it's Keyshot.com or Luxion, I'll put the link down below the video, but you should definitely download the demo and mess around with it. It's surprisingly rewarding how quick you'll get up and running with it. In the last video in this rendering series, I'll be doing a rendering in Keyshot as well as V-Ray, so you can get a sense of how each works, as well as how choosing and setting up the right environment is critical to the final output of the rendering. We'll get into a little more detail in that video. So anyway, in the next video, we're going to cover the main types of lights that you'll use for your rendering, how you can use those to make your scene a little more exciting and dynamic. So thanks so much for watching, and stay tuned.